This resource is the second of a two-part series on critical thinking. Part 1 defines critical thinking. It suggests common characteristics of critical thinkers and frames of mind that oppose critical thinking. Part 2 describes the process of critical thinking. It suggests a series of steps to increase critical thinking and explores each step in depth. We will look at the general process for critical thinking. Although it is presented as a set of steps, critical thinking is not a linear progression. Steps are repeated and performed nearly continuously. Maybe it would help you to think of this 6 steps more as 6 pillars that are holding up the pedestal of critical thinking. If any of the 6 pillars fail, then the pedestal becomes less stable, and your critical thinking may fail. The first, and perhaps most important step, is to evaluate your source. Because your background research is critical to your final product, you must ensure your data and research is valid. This is especially important if you use online sources. The next step is to maintain your objectivity. Remember that critical thinking is rational thinking, so work to minimize emotional responses. Another key critical thinking step is to distinguish between fact and opinion. You also want to evaluate the context of your material. An additional step in critical thinking is to recognize false logic and bias, but this really falls under the umbrella of evaluating the context. The final step is to use your core values and common sense to make your final decision. We will now look at each of these steps more in depth. As you research, you must evaluate your sources. Who is the author? Are they considered an expert? Or is it just a blog from someone living in their mom's basement? What did the author say? Is it consistent with other available information? Where was it published? Maybe there is political pressure to not say anything too controversial. For example, an article published about the inferiority of the Jewish race published in Nazi Germany would not be a very reliable source. When was the source produced? This is especially important in technical fields. Information becomes outdated and obsolete. For example, at one point, a 56K modem was cutting-edge technology. Also, why was your source created? The author may have a bias, or may just be producing controversial material to make a splash. Doing a careful evaluation of your sources is even more important if your research is done online. If possible, stick to peer-reviewed articles or sources with excellent reputations. Anyone can load information to wikis. Anyone. Maybe the post was written by a subject matter expert. Or maybe it was written by a 10-year-old who was bored and felt like making something up. A wiki may, or may not, have a proofing process before it is allowed to post, so you must be very careful. You should remain skeptical of information received from a wiki. Track any sources listed. Look them up and evaluate their veracity. If they check out, use them as your source. You should not cite information from a wiki. Find more reputable sources. Full disclosure, I do use Wikipedia to find information. Wikipedia is good for a very baseline understanding and basic information. But a scholarly work requires more credible sources. When doing research, you should seek to maintain objectivity. You should listen and find sources for all sides of an argument. Even if you will argue one side, you should still work to find the basic tenets of the opposing viewpoint. This will allow you to refute and hopefully disprove the other view. However, you should make sure that you understand the other view. It is not sufficient for your critical piece to boil down to, I'm right, you're wrong. Find actual facts to show exactly why you're right and the opposing view is wrong. What is your emotional response when faced with new information or situations? especially if the topic is controversial. Check to see if your response is rational or emotional. Do you stay calm, or do your emotions begin to ramp up? Do you find yourself wanting to argue, either for or against the topic? Does the information make you angry, sad, fearful, or depressed? Or does it give you a positive emotional response, making you happy or excited? Strong emotional responses make critical thinking difficult. To be a truly critical thinker, you must stay rational and avoid emotional responses. Think about some time you had a negative emotional response to something. Maybe it made you angry, or fearful, or sad. What happened to you? Your body dumps adrenaline into your system. Your pulse quickens, and you may have difficulty breathing. Your thinking becomes more scattered, but also more primal as a flee or fight response takes hold. These are not physical conditions conducive to clear, rational thinking. While it is hard to rein in your emotions, it is an ideal to work toward. Critical thinking requires rational thinking. Don't let your emotions rule. Facts are objectively verified. There is actual data to prove the fact correct. The situation behind the fact can be recreated. An opinion is a belief held with confidence. It is believed exactly because it is believed. It cannot be sustained by proof. However, not all opinions are necessarily wrong and/or invalid. For example, a doctor listening to your chest through a stethoscope will have an opinion about why you are phlegmy and achy. They will then make a diagnosis of bronchitis, but it is still an opinion. Because they have experience, I would choose to listen to the doctor's opinion and get medicine. Much of the work in evaluating the context of the source was done in evaluating the source itself. Work is not done in a vacuum. It is hard to isolate the information from the culture surrounding the author of the information. However, there are certain aspects of the context that require particular attention. Is there a bias? Bias is a tendency towards some perspective, to have some hidden preference or agenda. For example, an employee of Empire State would have a bias about the importance of education for non-traditional college students. They believe that non-traditional students face unique challenges, yet also bring a wealth of life experience to the college experience. You should also look for ambiguity in your source. Does the author speak generally, without much conviction? Do they revert to passive voice frequently? Or do they speak authoritatively and make firm, direct statements? You do not want to use wishy-washy sources in a scholarly work. Is the information outdated? Make certain that you have reasonably current research to support your statements. Or is the information simply wrong? Nothing devalues a work like weak source material. You want your research to provide a strong foundation for your critical thinking. So what exactly should you look for to avoid bias, ambiguity, obsolescence, or inaccuracy? Make sure that the source was objective. Did they rely on logic and provide information dispassionately? Or did they have an agenda? Look for the credentials of the author. Are they a respected source with sufficient background? Do they have degrees from respected sources? For example, I would take law advice from a Harvard Law School graduate before I would from someone who took an Intro to Law course at a local community college. Look at the date of the source. Is it reasonably current? Or has the field changed drastically since publication? Also, look at the reputation of the source. I would put more stock in an article from the New York Times before the National Enquirer, for example. Also, look for concurrence with other sources. Has research been independently verified? Do other experts have similar opinions? Or is your source a lone voice in the wilderness? Sometimes you will have to choose which of conflicting sources to use. Both are credible and critical. How do you choose? You use your core values. What do you believe in, and what is important to how you live your life? Do you place great import on being accountable? How committed are you to various beliefs or aspects of your life? Do you look to be open and honest in all dealings with others? Or are you led by your desire to be responsible? Does giving characterize your nature? When making choices about which sources to use, or for any choice to be made, you must be true to yourself and use your common sense. If a source does not match the focus of your topic, don't use it. So, you want to be considered a critical thinker? You want logic and rationality to be the key words in your thinking? Here's how you ensure that you stay critical. Use reliable sources. Check and recheck the source and its context. Make sure you separate fact from opinion. It is acceptable to use opinions in your scholarly work. Just make certain you label them as such. Stay flexible in your thinking. Don't get locked into one belief. Be able to change your mind, as evidence dictates. Practice emotional restraint. Don't let your emotions sway your thoughts one way or another. Stay objective. Be a dispassionate reporter. Just the facts, ma'am. Reserve judgment until you have seen all the evidence. Always question. Be skeptical and wonder why statements are made. And always seek the truth, for it will set you free.